and also joined for this conversation by Automobile Association spokesperson Layton Beard. Layton, good to have you with us again. Morning.
Thank you, Sakina. Good to be with you on a day that precedes the dropping of the fuel price. So yes, I think it's a better day than I think some other months.
I wish it was better, Layton, because as you say, yes, it is good news, but I don't hear many motorists too excited about this. Just in terms of the drop, if you look at since last year to date, more than R6 increase in the price of petrol. So you can understand why perhaps motorists aren't that excited. But have they become too despondent, according to you?
No, I think motorists are rightly very concerned about the rising fuel costs, and it's something that we're seeing throughout the world as well. People in almost every other country in the world are also very concerned about these rising fuel costs. So I do think that there is an element of pessimism around these fuel costs. And as we know, when the fuel price increases, it has such an impact on every other cost as well, of everybody's lives, not only motorists, of consumers. So certainly, I think there is an element of bleakness around the fuel price because of that factor. But from our perspective, we are very happy with the fact that obviously the fuel price is coming down for August. It's not going to have a major impact on consumer goods prices right now. Obviously, we'd like to see a situation where fuel price decreases filter into the economy, but that'll happen when the fuel price decreases over a consistent period of time. I think for us, the big thing is that August is not another month in which we're seeing an increase. It is quite a significant decrease of R1 plus to fuel. So for us, that is good news. It's something obviously we'd like to now see is sustained going forward. It is good news. It's not an increase, but we definitely understand that there is a bleakness amongst motorists that it's not more significant to bring us back in line with what we paid maybe 6 months ago.
So, Layton, let's talk about the factors that influence the recent fuel increases and also the question around the levy. So government has reinstated that. But again, motorists would argue that it could have been maintained, even if just at a certain level, in order to further cushion the blow.
Look, the two main factors that influence the fuel price locally, the two main factors are obviously the international oil prices and then the Rand-US dollar exchange rate. Now, we saw, and both of those are taken on a daily basis, and they averaged out over the period of the month to give us whether there's going to be an increase or a decrease to the fuel price locally. So the international petroleum prices have certainly decreased steadily enough that they gave us a very significant decrease going into August. And we must remember it would have been more significant had that levy concession been maintained to the fuel price, which obviously now we know it hasn't. And then the Rand was weak for much of the month. It seems to be strengthening again going into August. So both of those factors, I think, played very well to give us the decrease that we're seeing now. Will it be maintained going from August into September? I mean, certainly we hope so. And I think the numbers at the moment, at this very premature stage, are indicating that they may be. This issue of the levies is a very interesting one. We've seen a lot of people saying, well, let's continue with a concession that we had of R1.50 or at least 75 cents. Government, on the other hand, is saying, well, we can't do that. We've sold our strategic fuel stocks. We can't cover the losses that we're going to suffer through that. So we have to return that money. But I think it speaks to a bigger issue. And that bigger issue for us is let's review the fuel price. And we've been asking for this for a very long time. Let's review the fuel price to determine whether all of the elements that comprise a litre of fuel are A, still necessary to be part of that fuel price, and B, are calculated correctly and are audited. So for us, that process is still very much necessary, even though we're seeing a decrease in the fuel price now. It's, nothing is to say that we're not going to see increases before the end of the year again. So it's very important for us that South Africans are on the same page as government in terms of what every litre of fuel is comprised of and how those figures are determined and arrived at and whether they are correct or not. And we still think that such a review is absolutely 100% necessary.
So, given just how bleak things are on the ground and at the pumps in particular, Layton, has government given any indication that they are seriously thinking, at the very least, about reviewing this makeup of the levy?
You know, there was some murmurs a couple of months back that they wanted to engage with certain civil society and private sector and academic organizations regarding that, and it's gone a little bit quiet. What we have heard, obviously, now is this proposal by government to put a cap on 93 unleaded fuel, which has its own complexities, and the fuel retailers will tell you that that's going to damage their businesses. So, you know, from our perspective, we think that a review, the one that we've asked for, the one that we think is necessary, needs to get off the ground sooner rather than later. And I think, you know, the AA, along with other organizations and academics and the private sector, are very willing to be part of that process, but it needs to be driven by government. So yes, I think there have been some developments in that regard, but certainly not enough in our view to get the ball rolling in the right direction.
So, Layton, if we look at how that levy is constituted again, you know, just in terms of the various components thereof, what would the AA suggest in terms of the research that you've done are some of the components that government perhaps could scrap or even just modify with regard to that levy?
Yeah, I mean, the general fuel levy currently stands at R3.93 a litre, and there's been a lot of calls for the scrapping of that levy. You know, it generates 90 billion rand to the fiscus annually. So if you were to scrap that levy, government would be out of pocket by effectively 90 billion rand plus. And no government in the world wants to give up that revenue stream, something that is easy to collect on such a consistent basis. So our concern would be that if that levy was scrapped, government would simply look for alternative ways in which to fill that gap. They may increase existing taxes, or they may introduce new taxes. So it would be counterproductive to scrap that levy, in our view, because that money would be generated somewhere else, and it may be more problematic for consumers down the line. The Road Accident Fund levy, on the other hand, which is currently pegged at R2.18 a litre, is something that we think requires urgent attention. One of the big issues for us is why we have such an over-reliance on the RAF in the first place. It's a fund that is intended to compensate victims of crashes. And we have to ask the question, but why do we have so many crashes in our country in the first place? And why do we have such an over-reliance on the RAF? Now, that is an issue that comes down to, do we have proper road safety in South Africa? And the answer, quite simply, Sakina, is we do not. So for us, dealing with the issue of road safety is very critical to dealing with the issue of fuel pricing going further down the road, because it will relieve that pressure on the RAF. So that for us is a very important thing that needs to happen immediately, along with, in our view, a review of the management of the RAF and private sector involvement in the RAF, specifically in the claims management process. So part of the reason why we're calling for a review is to flesh out issues such as this specifically. And the issue of the general fuel levy in that review may come to light, and there may be some suggestions on how better to deal with that. But I think we also need to be very honest with ourselves in terms of the fuel pricing and where the money that the levies generates goes. And that raises issues of the appropriation or misappropriation of funds, corruption, and how that is being dealt with, because South Africans are paying money to the government, but that's that money being put into action. And I think therein lies a very critical part of the answer that you've just asked.
And I think the RAF is at the moment symptomatic of all of those issues, because it is technically bankrupt, this institution, and yet R2.18 out of every litre goes towards this specific fund. So if we were to do away with the RAF, that levy, R2.18, is that going to, is that something that government can compensate for in another way? And if so, how, Layton?
So I think, let me be clear that the AA is not calling for the scrapping of the RAF. I mean, I think what we would like to see is a situation where the RAF is better managed, the finances are better dealt with. But again, it comes down to have this over-reliance on the RAF in the first place. As a society, we need to be dealing better with road safety.
And I hear you there, and I appreciate that you're not necessarily asking for the scrapping of it. I am basically positing that idea. If we were to do away with it, if that is a possibility, one, and if it is, how would that affect the current system of compensating people for crashes on our roads? Can we deal with that in a different way?
I think there are many proposals that are on the table in terms of how to generate the money through licensing and through other third-party insurance in terms of dealing with the RAF. Is that the right way forward? Perhaps in the short term, no, it isn't. Only 35%, 30 to 35% of vehicles on our roads currently are insured. And that is part of the problem that South Africa faces as well. We need more people to be insured because that will also reduce the reliance on the RAF going forward. So scrapping the RAF as an institution now, in our view, is not the correct way. I think it may be a long-term solution. We need at the moment a better short-term solution. And that better short-term solution, in our view, requires massive intervention in the RAF and ubiquitous road safety campaigns to deal better with the root cause of why we have the RAF in the first place.
So just as we wrap this up, Layton, besides the Russia-Ukraine war, which is currently, the go-to explanation when people are talking about all sorts of increases, be it food prices or fuel prices. But, just looking at that situation, how is that likely to impact on these prices in the short to medium term period for us?
I think what we've seen already is that international petroleum prices have increased, and they did so in June, a little bit in July, but they've come down again. We've said it all along that the longer that crisis in Ukraine continues, the longer it's going to put pressure on those international oil prices. So obviously that is a concern. We've got to look at the factor of the Rand-US dollar exchange rate, currently quite weak against the US dollar, above 16 Rand 60. That is something also, in our view, that needs to be considered in terms of the fuel pricing going forward. There needs to be a climate of economic certainty, less bureaucracy in terms of dealing with a local economy that impacts on that exchange rate. But certainly that situation in the Ukraine, I think, as long as it continues, is going to continue putting pressure on the fuel price locally. Not only locally, Sakina, but throughout the world as well.
So I'm just reminded of something before I let you go, Layton. I think growing up, cars used to have this disc, I think it used to say third party, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
So what was that, and how was that different from what we are seeing now with the levy and the part of it, that R2.18 that goes to the road accident fund?
Well, the third-party insurance essentially was exactly that. It was a fund that was created to provide money to relieve issues around and to compensate victims of crashes. And we know that is no longer in use. So, the RAF levy gets most of its money now, or, a bulk of its money from government through the R2.18 levy. There have been calls for the reintroduction of the third party. There have been calls for, different modelings of insurance to deal with those for those people that have vehicles, and how that can play out in terms of funding for the RAF. So there are various models that have been put on the table. Are all of those models going to work? We know that government has also thought of, a road accident benefit scheme. That is something that's on the table as well. There are various models. But again, I bring you back to this issue that with all of these proposals that are out there, and with all of the suggestions that have been given in terms of dealing effectively with the fuel price, because that's the question that we have on the table at the moment, it cannot just be a piecemeal suggestion by one group or one organization or one party or whatever. It needs to be a considered, consistent approach, and that needs to be driven by government, and they need to involve all of these other role players, where the issues that you are raising now can be discussed and consensus can be reached on what is the best way going forward. Do we need a reintroduction of an insurance scheme such as third party? Do we need to reduce the fuel levy? Do we need to deal better with the RAF, and how do we do that? Those are the types of questions we think need to be answered in a forum such as the one that we are suggesting be established.
And hopefully that will happen sooner rather than later, Layton. And thanks so much for your time as always. Layton Beard is Automobile Association of South Africa's spokesperson, speaking to us there about the imminent fuel price decrease midnight tomorrow, and fuel will go down by at least, how much was it, R1.32 for both grades of petrol, and 91 cents a litre for diesel. Also R1.44 drop per litre in the price of illuminating paraffin.